When it comes to the wrath of the cartel, especially notoriously evil groups like Los Zetas, there is really no punishment too cruel and inhumane to be considered. In the world of cartels, Los Zetas are infamous for their brutality, but what if I told you their methods went far beyond what most people could even imagine? The cartel loves to utilize torture, and some of the methods that they prefer are so heinous and disturbing that it's hard to believe that those responsible are truly human. These aren't just stories of violence. We're talking about the worst tactics ever recorded, acts designed to break their enemies physically and mentally, and it's all real. From feeding a human being to tigers while they are still alive, to public executions caught on camera for the world to see. These torture methods are sure to keep you up at night. Stick around as we uncover the terrifying techniques Los Zetas use to strike fear into their rivals and anyone who dared to stand in their way. You won't believe the depths of cruelty we're about to explore. Los Zetas are one of the most infamous and brutal drug cartels in Mexico. Los Zetas' brutality didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was rooted in their beginnings as highly trained soldiers. Originally, they were members of Mexico's elite special forces, experts in counterinsurgency tactics. These weren't your average street criminals. They were ex-military personnel, trained to handle extreme situations with precision and cold efficiency. They were formed in the late 1990s by former members of the Mexican Armed Forces, who were initially recruited by the Gulf Cartel to serve as bodyguards for its leader, Ociel Cardenas Gideon. To fully understand how this group came to be, when they defected to the criminal world, becoming the armed wing of the Gulf Cartel, they brought those deadly skills with them. This military background shaped not only how they operated, but also how they terrorized their enemies. They knew how to plan, how to strike, and most importantly, how to intimidate on a massive scale. We have to look back in time to the late 1990s. What set Los Zetas apart from other cartels was how they weaponized their military knowledge. This wasn't just about smuggling drugs or controlling territory. It was about instilling fear, and they used violence as their primary tool. When Los Zetas finally broke off from the Gulf Cartel to form their own organization, they evolved into something far more terrifying. They moved beyond the typical violence of cartel wars and took things to an extreme level. Torture wasn't just a method for them, it was a performance, a spectacle designed to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies, law enforcement, and even innocent civilians. Aside from their military skills, the group also became notorious for popularizing the use of especially gruesome and disturbing propaganda videos. Los Zetas knew that violence alone wasn't enough. To maintain their dominance, they needed to showcase their brutality publicly. They turned torture into a tool of terror, not just killing rivals, but making sure everyone knew what would happen to those who crossed them. They filmed these tortures, shared them online, and made sure that their message reached as far as possible. Bodies left hanging from bridges, decapitated heads on display. These weren't just executions, they were statements of power. Another video that Los Zetas Infamous recorded and released featured their brutal execution of 4 women. One of Los Zetas' most infamous methods of torture was beheading. This wasn't a quiet execution done behind closed doors. No, they made sure these beheadings were seen by as many people as possible. Their members would film the entire process, from the terrified screams of the victims to the final gruesome moments, and then they'd upload these videos online for all to see. These videos were meant to go viral, spreading fear like wildfire. In a time where social media was rapidly growing, Los Zetas used these platforms as their own twisted stage, and people couldn't look away, no matter how much they wanted to. The videos showed several men, bound and helpless, lined up and beheaded one by one. The video sent shockwaves not only through Mexico, but worldwide, leaving people terrified and stunned at the sheer brutality. This wasn't just a murder, it was a spectacle designed to show power, and it worked. Rival cartels, citizens, and law enforcement all knew that Los Zetas didn't just kill, they turned death into a performance. Video is so extremely graphic that it has been scrubbed from most corners of the internet, all but for a few snippets and screenshots. But perhaps one of the most grotesque methods Los Zetas became known for was something they called la guitarra, or the guitar. In this method, they would cut their victims' bodies in such a way that the wounds resembled the shape of a guitar. It was one of the most horrific public executions in their arsenal. The victims, often alive when the started would have their torsos slashed open, their ribs pulled apart to mimic the strings of a guitar. This method wasn't just about killing, it was about making the victim's final moments as agonizing and drawn out as possible. The bodies of those tortured in this way would often be left in public places for all to see, serving as a message to others that defying Los Zetas would lead to not just death, but the most painful death imaginable. It was psychological warfare at its finest, instilling fear not only in their enemies, but in the hearts of entire communities. Corkscrews were inserted into the victim's muscles. They were then ripped back out by one, but the pain didn't stop there. They then placed burning hot chilies in the victim's nose and on his open wounds. It was only after he had suffered as much pain as he could possibly take that he finally ended his life. In some cases, the cruelty went even further. Burning victims alive became another one of Los Zetas' favorite tactics, used not just to eliminate enemies, but to terrorize entire towns. The sheer horror of being burned alive is something most people can't even fathom, and Los Zetas used this method to send a message that they weren't just about violence, they were about domination through terror. One of the most infamous incidents involving this method was the San Fernando massacre, where dozens of people were burned alive. This wasn't a small, isolated incident. It was a public display of power. The message was clear. Los Zetas had no limits. The carnage they left behind wasn't just a warning to rival cartels, it was a warning to everyone. These acts of extreme violence created a chilling atmosphere in the regions they controlled, as communities lived in constant fear that they could be next. Then there was El Lazo, or the tire torture. In this method, a tire was filled with gasoline and placed around the victim's neck. They were then set on fire, burning alive in one of the most agonizing and drawn-out deaths imaginable. This method, like the others, was often filmed and shared widely. Another sick way, Los Zetas cemented their reputation as the most brutal cartel in Mexico. The slow, excruciating deaths caused by El Lazo weren't just meant to kill the victims, they were meant to break the spirit of anyone who witnessed the aftermath or saw the videos. These horrifying scenes often unfolded in broad daylight in front of entire towns, further embedding the fear Los Zetas thrived on. The sight of a human being consumed by flames, screaming in agony, was something no one could forget. These acts left scars, not just on the families of the victims, but on whole communities. And one of the executioners then begins an incredibly bloody and disturbing process of dismembering him. He starts by attempting to hack off the victim's feet, causing the victim to scream uncontrollably. Even after both of his feet have been chopped off, the victim is still fully conscious and awake. And if burning or beheading wasn't enough, Los Zetas also employed slow, torturous dismemberment as a form of execution. Victims would be tied up and their limbs slowly removed one by one, sometimes while they were still conscious. Los Zetas often filmed these dismemberments too, ensuring that the footage was circulated to send a very clear message. This is what happens to those who cross us. Unlike a quick death by gunshot, dismemberment was intended to draw out the suffering for as long as possible. The fear of experiencing such a brutal death was enough to keep people in line, both within the cartel and in the broader communities they controlled. The message was simple: no one is safe, and defiance will be met with the worst fate imaginable. These videos typically feature horrific executions designed to instill fear in their enemies and anyone who might oppose them. While they were not the first to film such executions, what made Los Zetas' methods particularly terrifying wasn't just the brutality, it was how public they made it. The more gruesome the death, the more they wanted people to see it, hear about it, and fear it. It wasn't enough to kill their enemies. They needed everyone to know exactly what kind of pain and suffering they could inflict. And in doing so, they forever changed the landscape of cartel violence. For Los Zetas, death was only the beginning. They weren't interested in quick killings that would be over and done with. Instead, they focused on methods that were as slow and painful as possible. By drawing out the suffering, they turned each murder into a horrific spectacle. The message was clear: if you stood against them, your end would be agonizing, and everyone would know about it. They wanted people to fear not just dying, but the brutal, inhuman way they would make it happen. One of the most infamous tactics Los Zetas used was the public display of mutilated bodies. After carrying out their gruesome executions, they didn't just dispose of the bodies quietly. Instead, they would leave the corpses in highly visible areas like highways, bridges, or the center of towns. These public displays were meant to send a chilling message: This is what happens when you cross us. The towns and cities under Los Zetas' rule were gripped by terror. People were afraid to leave their homes, unsure of when or where the next display of violence might occur. It was more than just intimidation. It was a way to keep entire populations under their control, too terrified to resist or speak out against them.
I think they saw that scared, panicked look in my face and asked me if I had ever killed somebody. And I said I had, knowing that I never took nobody's life. So he pulled out a handgun, told me to kill that person, the one kneeling in front of her. And I just shot him.
Fear was Los Zetas' most powerful weapon. By instilling terror in civilians, they ensured that no one would challenge their rule. Los Zetas mastered the art of controlling territories through sheer terror. The more brutal their tactics, the more people fell in line. They didn't need to engage in constant battles with their enemies when fear did most of the work for them. Civilians, rival cartels, and government officials were all paralyzed by the thought of what could happen if they stood in Los Zetas' way. Los Zetas certainly brought this tactic to the forefront, and it continues to be used by various cartels today, including the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG. Los Zetas set a terrifying new standard in cartel violence, and it didn't take long for other groups to follow in their bloody footsteps. Perhaps the most infamous of these copycats is the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG. Like Los Zetas, the CJNG quickly gained a reputation for extreme brutality, and they weren't shy about showcasing their violence. They made headlines with their own gruesome beheading videos that quickly spread across the internet, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies and civilians alike. The CJNG's brutal acts were nearly as infamous as those of Los Zetas, proving that the blueprint of fear created by the Zetas had inspired a new generation of criminals. The CJNG's violent rise to power was, in part, due to how they adopted many of the same tactics Los Zetas pioneered. Public executions and grotesque displays of violence became central to their strategy as they aimed to assert dominance in Mexico's increasingly chaotic drug war. Just like Los Zetas, the CJNG didn't simply kill their enemies, they dehumanized them. Victims were often treated as nothing more than tools to send a message, their bodies mutilated and displayed in public spaces. It wasn't just about eliminating rivals, it was about ensuring everyone, rival cartels, law enforcement, and civilians, knew who was in control. But CJNG wasn't the only cartel to take notes from Los Zetas. Other criminal groups, like La Familia Michoacana and the Gulf Cartel, also began using similar methods to assert control over their territories. Torture, mutilation, and public executions became a staple in cartel warfare, with each group trying to outdo the others in sheer brutality. It was a race to the bottom, where the most violent acts became a badge of power and fear. This kind of propaganda's sole purpose was not always just to intimidate the enemies of Los Zetas. Sometimes they would use it to attract new members.
In April 2008, a huge banner appeared over a busy highway in Nuevo Laredo, a key drug trafficking city on the US-Mexico border. This turned out to be a recruitment poster for the ultra-violent Zetas cartel, offering men with military experience, good salaries, food, and benefits for joining their emerging criminal army.
One of the most disturbing aspects of this wave of cartel violence is how quickly it spread, largely thanks to social media. While the cartels had always been brutal, the internet gave them a new platform to amplify their terror. Videos of torture and executions that were once only meant to intimidate local rivals were now being broadcast to millions across the world. It was no longer just about controlling territory. It was about making a statement to the entire world. Social media, once seen as a tool for connection, had been twisted into something far darker, serving as a stage for the cartel's acts of cruelty. As the violence spread, entire towns were paralyzed with fear. Innocent civilians, who just wanted to live their lives in peace, were forced to exist in a constant state of terror. Public executions and mutilated bodies left in town squares were a grim reminder that no one was safe. In these regions, it wasn't just about avoiding danger. It was about surviving in a place where violence had become part of daily life. The emotional and psychological toll on the victims and their families was immeasurable. Losing a loved one is always painful, but knowing they died in such a brutal, public way leaves wounds that may never heal. Entire generations were left traumatized by the violence they witnessed or the fear they lived in, with some communities forever scarred by the legacy of cartel brutality. One of the greatest challenges in confronting Los Zetas' reign of terror was the powerlessness of law enforcement. Mexican authorities found themselves outmatched not just in resources, but in the overwhelming influence that Los Zetas wielded. Corruption within law enforcement and government agencies made it nearly impossible to fully combat the cartel's growing power. Many local officers were on the cartel's payroll, either turning a blind eye to the violence or actively participating in it. This lack of accountability only emboldened the Zetas to continue their violent rule without fear of repercussions. Even when the Mexican government made attempts to crack down on the cartels, they found themselves ill-prepared to handle the level of brutality they were facing. Los Zetas weren't just another criminal organization. They were a militarized force, armed with advanced weapons and trained in tactics far beyond what most local police could handle. It was a war on their own soil, and the authorities were often losing. Despite these challenges, there were moments when the government managed to strike back. High-profile leaders were captured or killed, and major operations were launched to dismantle the cartel's influence. But even with these victories, the question remains: did they truly make a lasting impact? More often than not, when one cartel was weakened, another would rise to take its place, continuing the cycle of violence. The United States Justice Department has relentlessly pursued the Chapitos for not only the horrendous torture methods, but their role in the fentanyl war, which is being raged across the country. Attorney General Merrick B. Garland and the rest of his team at the United States Justice Department shocked the nation in 2023 when they detailed some of the horrific ways that the Chapitos torture and execute their victims. This included not only feeding them to wild animals, but injecting them over and over again with fentanyl. The United States also played a role in attempting to curb cartel violence. Through the DEA and other law enforcement agencies, the U.S. worked to stop the flow of drugs and violence at the border. But with the cartel's vast resources and their influence spreading beyond Mexico, this proved to be a daunting task. While some successes were made, the cartel's deep-rooted presence in both Mexico and the U.S. made it difficult to fully dismantle their operations. Mexican society is left grappling with how to respond to the ongoing violence. While some have chosen to speak out, many feel trapped in a system where brutality has become the norm. The younger generation, in particular, faces the challenge of growing up in a world where violence is constant and solutions feel distant. There are glimmers of hope as more and more citizens demand change, but the road ahead is long and uncertain. The public's exhaustion with the bloodshed is palpable. After years of endless violence, many Mexican citizens are desperate for change. But while the desire for peace is strong, achieving it is another story altogether. The question now is whether the country can find a way to break free from this cycle of violence, or if the cartel's legacy of fear and brutality has left a mark too deep to heal. After hearing about the horrific torture methods used by Los Zetas, do you think there's any way to stop this level of violence, or has it become too ingrained in cartel culture? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Stay safe, and thanks for watching.